All right, well, welcome to Association Chat. This is an online discussion for the association community where you can warm yourselves by the virtual fire with topics of the day, welcoming thought leaders and trailblazers alike to join up in this online home for the community. I'm the host of Association Chat, KiKi L'Italien, and today we're talking with the founder of the new quo, Christina Blacken, about how we can change the status quo through narrative intelligence. Ooh, I'm so excited. What is narrative intelligence? How can we change the status quo with it? It's all of these questions and more. So welcome, welcome, welcome. I'm so glad that you're here, Christina.
Well, thank you for having me. And I love that we have matching lipstick right now. I mean, it's
I know.
definitely a move to have red lipstick.
We didn't even plan this, and here we are. I mean, it should show that we're in sync and we're ready to go. So I introduced you, and I talked about the status quo just for a second, or the new quo for a second. What is the new quo? Talk to me about the new quo.
So the new quo, I originally started about 4 or 5 years ago as a content experiment because I was working in corporate America, and I had noticed that all the stories that were being shared around minority entrepreneurship were literally pretty much non-existent. And I knew that there were all these really interesting trends of individuals who were creating something from nothing. Maybe they weren't billionaires per se, but they were doing really incredible things. So I started to cover these stories and write them on a blog. And then eventually I realized over time, as I was, continuing my career and using storytelling in my career to sell products or to motivate people to get involved in social causes, that storytelling was not only just this thing we like to do and to consume, but it could be an actual tool for behavior change. And I was fascinated by that. So I chased my curiosity. I started doing research on storytelling and its effect on our beliefs, our behaviors, our biases. And then from there, I developed my own frameworks and started teaching around certain topics when it comes to culture, to behavior change, to diversity and inclusion. And now the new quo is a leadership development company. And I focus primarily on helping groups to really figure out how do you use the psychology of story to not only connect more effectively with people not like yourself, but to unpack your own beliefs and behaviors and change them appropriately so we can be more transformational and inclusive leaders. And I think right now we're in a time where all the dominant narratives we believed about leadership and success and how society should function is changing and it's shifting. And we're in this really crazy time. It feels literally like the roller coaster, something I've seen on the internet being shared around as a meme. It's really the roller coaster. But the silver lining is now that we get to dismantle some of these narratives that didn't work, what are we building in its place? And that's what I'm excited about being part of.
I think it is really exciting because unlike any other time in my life, I can say, I feel like there is a willingness to look at the things that people mostly would sweep under the rug or just wanted to kind of smooth over for the time being, to make it as easy to deal with as possible. And it feels like it's a time where people are saying, nope, it's time to clean this up. And it's an interesting thing to see because it is kind of like ripping the Band-Aid off. But I think all of us are kind of in this wait and see mode where it's like, okay, is this for real this time? Are we really going to do something and make meaningful change on a grand scale? And as a country, I feel like even though this is happening outside of the United States too, these discussions, I feel like as a country, we're at a pivotal time where we're making decisions about, our identity as a society and as a country.
I love that. And I love that you bring up this fact about identity because it relates to narrative and story so well. So much of our identities as individuals, within our communities, within our countries and our societies are heavily shaped by narratives. I mean, we pick them up from school, from our upbringing in home, from our religious practices, from the politics and policies around us. And a lot of the time, I don't think we examine them. They kind of seem like immutable truths. And right now, we're having these really serious discussions of, well, what is leadership exactly? Is leadership really about a hierarchy and sort of haves and have-nots, and some people get resources and some don't? Is leadership really about identifying everyone's unique talents, bringing those talents to the table to solve problems we're insatiably curious about. And I think now we get to figure out, okay, well, some of this didn't work. Clearly, that's why we are here right now, is some of the things that we believed to be the only way that our country or our systems or our organizations could work have led us to this pandemic. This idea of money over everything else, not thinking about, societal impacts or environmental impacts, or even just this idea of not thinking about the future, having future planning top of mind and being very short-sighted with our business decisions and how we operate. And so now people are like, oh, maybe those don't work. And actually, we can change them if we constructed these before. And I think people forget that a lot of the things that we practice now as organizations have not been around forever. The human society has constantly evolved, and we've always figured out different ways to interact and collaborate with one another and survive. And this is just another flavor of that, and we're seeing what works and what doesn't. So what I'm excited about seeing is people understanding and knowing that the status quo isn't permanent. And if it's not permanent, what parts do we want to keep that we think are great? For instance, with technology, we now have the touch of our fingertips, the ability to get information and stories and experiences from around the world in little to no time. That we've never had a time in human history where we had that kind of access to information. So we might want to keep that. But there are other aspects of, well, is the power structures we have, do they make sense? Are they really getting us what we need as a society, as an organization, as a country? And so that's where I spend a lot of my mental energy and time is, how do we build new systems? How do we have new conversations? And how those conversations lead into equitable practices that are not just a one and done, but part of our DNA and part of our identities.
There are so many things that you just said that I just, it sets me on fire, and it makes me think of a dozen more questions to ask you. But let me just hit on the first one, and that is your thoughts on innovation and looking at the future. I think are extremely exciting, and the thing that I like about so much about what I've heard you say in other interviews and what you touched on here is that you actually push back on the space of futurism quite a bit. And you say a lot of times what people are calling innovation and what they're saying, about looking into the future, these are old ideas, really. I mean, they're the same old thing, and we need to be looking at solving problems that are very real and that have a bigger impact. Can you talk to me a little bit more about that? Because I just love the fact that you don't let technology distract you from the bigger picture. So talk to me a little bit about new ways of looking at innovation.
Absolutely. I love that framing of it. Well, it really boils down to that term that you brought up in the beginning, which is narrative intelligence. That's what I say my work is founded on, the methodology that I approach things with. And it's a term that's not as familiar. I actually learned the term from a friend who works in the technology space. And I was talking to him about my work, and he was like, that's narrative intelligence, right? I'm like, well, what? Like, what is that? And so, people are very familiar with EQ and emotional intelligence, and that's become more popular. But narrative intelligence is really this idea that actually began in the artificial intelligence industry. And the idea was, well, the only thing separating us from robots or other technology is their ability to speak in narrative and to think in narrative. Robots can't do that at this point. They can kind of replicate algorithms, or they can do certain things, but they can't naturally, in certain ways, construct narrative in the ways that human brains do. And so they were trying to figure out how to do that, how to make that connection. And at the end of the day, the human brain is automatically wired to organize information around us in narrative structures. And there's a couple of reasons for that. The first being, it's easier for us to remember events when we have a narrative or a story attached to it. We make snap decisions. We're making hundreds and hundreds of decisions a day, usually on autopilot. And narratives help us to go through the catalog of our experiences, pick a appropriate narrative to then make a decision or an action. And so what's really fascinating about innovation and narrative intelligence is if you don't invest in your narrative intelligence, you can't innovate. Because if you can't understand how story not only shapes people's perceptions and behaviors, but your own, you might continuously replicate things that are not necessarily that innovative. So for example, when they get a lot of the innovation space, the places where people are innovating from do not have social or cultural context. There's huge gaps of information. They're lacking perspectives from different places and spaces. And so the problems they even focus on are problems that are only really relevant to a small demographic or to an elite demographic or to a wealthy demographic or a white demographic, whatever those parameters might be. And I think being able to improve your narrative intelligence allows you to have better cultural competency so that you can innovate in new ways. I think one great example of this is recently, not right now with COVID, this is the first time we've had this many scientists focus on the same problem at the same time. And they are rapidly innovating in the medical space in ways we've never seen. Now, I'm not going to be taking that vaccine for a while. We got to test it a few times before it's viable, right? Like, definitely give me like
right,
a fifth or fourth, fifth or sixth trial.
Just a second.
Right. But the speed of innovation is because we have so many different individuals from around the world all focus at the same exact time, bringing their own perspectives, their own cultural histories, their own approaches, their points of view, and we're able to innovate far more quickly than that. And a lot of that boils down to as well to divergent thinking, which is a core part of creativity. Divergent thinking is the ability to take two disparate ideas and make a new connection between them or a new insight. And the more diverse perspectives you have and experiences and backgrounds, the more likely you will have better divergent thinking. So I think innovation really has to start with people examining what dominant narratives are shaping people's belief systems and their behaviors, and realize and understanding which ones are missing. If we're not necessarily bringing every voice to the table, we're not really innovating. You can't innovate in a bubble or in an insular space. It's just not possible.
Well, I think that this is such an important thing to talk about in the association space, especially because for the longest time, associations, we gather around a common purpose. We gather around a common goal. And that's the whole point of having an association. But associations, have been talking about for quite some time, looking at businesses as examples, looking at for-profits as examples, looking at ways to innovate. And yet, at this point, when there's a time when we're facing a crisis, it becomes very apparent why associations exist in the first place and why it's important to have an organization that is different than a for-profit, can exist for different purposes and different reasons other than making a profit. However, innovating is critical to the success and the longevity of our associations. And so when you're speaking about where not having diversity can lead to a lack of innovation and that being a flaw and that being a potential real problem for associations, I have to say that's something that we have to pay attention to. And right now with things like Black Lives Matter, I know a lot of association executives are probably asking themselves, am I doing enough? How do I know if I'm doing what I need to be doing, or if there's a sign, some sort of gauge of, am I achieving what I need to achieve, and looking at, pursuing diversity and inclusivity and making sure that we have enough different voices at the table. Mm-hmm. So when you go to work with organizations, how do you approach that? Is there some sort of way that an association executive can know whether there's, are there red flags saying, wow, you really need to start working on this right now?
I think a lot of it starts with education. And I saw some really interesting statistics about professional development recently, which was, I think it was around 70% of employees really crave leadership development, but their organizations, around 10% of them are actually investing time and money and energy into developing skills and learning. And what I find fascinating, one of the dominant narratives we have about schooling is it ends when you're 18 or maybe a few more years if you go to college. And most individuals aren't required or pushed to continuously engage their intellect and their creativity and their information and their education unless they self-elect into it, or maybe if they have a profession where you have to have certain credentials that you renew every year. But most people, that's kind of where that growth and pushing yourself out of your comfort zone stops. And even then in our education system, there are huge gaps when it comes to social justice, racial theory, past history, and policies. So I think it's important when I work with organizations, I start with anti-bias training, which really unpacks what are the dominant narratives that we have about race and how have they shaped our country deeply? They're a huge part of our DNA, and it's sort of the boogeyman in the room that everyone wants to ignore and not voice or speak about. But now that we're in a time where people are having to shelter in place, we have 40 million plus people unemployed. There are people who are being murdered regularly for no reason in their beds, walking outside, taking a jog, Black people. People are like, we have to have this conversation. This is something that didn't just pop up overnight. This is a breaking point. This is a straw on the camel's back. And I think we've gotten to this place because the lack of education and pretty much sweeping it under the rug has caused us to have these huge cultural gaps and these dominant narratives where, well, if I'm not participating actively in a horrible thing, for instance, like burning a cross on a lawn or wearing a Ku Klux Klan hat, then I'm fine. And that's actually not the solve. I think the challenge for most people is, how do I become actively anti-racist? What does that take? And that requires, it's almost like going to the gym, really. If you went to the gym and you picked up one dumbbell one time, you would not be like, my health and my cardiovascular is on point. I lifted one weight one time in 1995.
Like
yeah.
I wish it worked like that. Yeah.
Where it's sort of like constantly investing in education. So what I do is trainings for organizations where it starts out with that baseline knowledge and information about what I call the culture of autopilot, which is really a series of behaviors and biases we pick up over time because of white supremacy and the history and the practices within our society and really globally. And then I talk about frameworks called the culture of curiosity, which is how do you work against that autopilot unconscious behavior so you can approach change and difference with an open, curious mindset and without fear and anxiety. Because curiosity still allows you to have some, apprehension potentially, but it also has a way of being able to be open to collecting information, not making assumptions or judgments or stereotypes, and then acting on that information appropriately. So I teach those frameworks. And then I think, coaching for leaders to be able to navigate the unique cultural challenge that they have, because every organization is different. Some organizations are having challenges with recruitment and they don't understand how to diversify their pipeline. Some are really struggling with their design and their product creation and trying to figure out, how do we make that more equitable? How do we make sure we're not leaving people out of design? Like a great example of that, which went viral not too long ago, was a tech company that was making the sensors for soap dispensers in a hotel, which you probably heard about. This was during the Comic-Con convention. A Black individual with darker skin kept trying to get soap and he could not get it out of the dispensers. And then he asked his white friend with lighter skin to do it, and it would work every time. And he's like, there's something wrong with the sensors. It can't actually detect darker skin. And that kind of cultural gap is created because people are making products without those sorts of things in mind when they're constructing algorithms or technology or putting their organization together. So I think that's the best start, is invest in your learning regularly and often. Improve your cultural competency, which means learning and reading and listening to people who do not look like you. And then examine your practices, audit them, and figure out which ones need to shift, even in small incremental ways, because you'd be surprised about the tiny things that people can do to bring more trust and belonging and understanding within their organization. And I give an example when it comes to cultural competency. Like for my personal life and experience, for the first 18 years of my life, I had to learn about cultures that were not my own. I had to learn from people who didn't look like me to be considered literate. I didn't get to learn about African history or African American culture. I had to go out of my way to learn that because it was not part of my curriculum. And that's most people in the country. There are some schools that are better than others with that, but that just shows you the kind of system we have set up. So if I had to do that just to be considered literate, it would make sense for individuals to learn about so many other cultures and backgrounds to be able to be considered culturally competent.
I think it's a great point because people, a lot of time don't think about they don't realize that they have the privilege that they do, or that they've grown up in a way that they've been learning a history and a culture that tied into one that they already identify with, and that isn't different from how they look or what their experience is. And I'm going to reach over here for a second. For those of you who are listening, you don't know why, but let me explain. Last week, I had Harriet Washington on as a guest, and she wrote Medical Apartheid, this book, and was talking about, which is, really the book, this award-winning book that goes into talking about the just massive inequality in research and in healthcare, and just a lot of the mistakes that have been made along the way. And I mean, just active wrongs that have been done along the way in testing vaccines on people who didn't know they were being tested on, or who thought that they might be helped, to just this enormous amount of, an absence of knowledge in an area in a time when we should have more than enough knowledge and research about, Black lives, Black health, but also, I mean, we hear about this with the discrepancies with women too all the time, about, not having enough research done and understanding women's bodies, which just seems bizarre. And when we don't take a second to take a look at what are we teaching people, what are we learning, and how do we make up for that lack of education along the way too? It's not too late for us to be learning, and it's not too late for us to get, wise to the things that we've missed maybe in school.
Yeah, that book is really powerful, and it really makes me remember I was doing a training for a nonprofit organization that's a global development organization, and they focus on helping people in developing countries motivate young people to volunteer and to get involved in causes. But their nonprofit board was very different from the people they served. It was mostly an all-white, mostly male, pretty wealthy nonprofit board. And so during this retreat, they wanted to do training to understand, what are we missing? What biases might we have? And I had them go through an exercise where they had to unpack their relationship to leadership. So what were the earliest leaders that they can remember from their upbringing when it came to their school, to their local businesses, the local government, the churches they were in, etc. And one individual was like, oh my gosh, this is the first time I've realized I've never had a person of color as a formal authority figure or leader. And I've never had a woman as a formal authority figure or leader in my life. And I didn't realize, and I think this person was late 50s.
Wow.
And so it was interesting to make that connection, because people don't really understand or notice that your experiences from those early moments until now shape who you are. They shape your behaviors and your practices. And even if they're unconscious, there could still be lots of inequities or things you've picked up just based on that upbringing. So making those connections and those docs is really powerful, because they were like, wow, I didn't realize that can make me more hesitant, or I'll make assumptions about who should be a leader, who should be in power, who should have resources, who should be listened to. And that's what matters. And I think that self-examination, the self-mastery, is critically important, and we do not do it enough, especially when it comes to leadership. Most individuals are externally focused, and they're saying, here's the issue, here's the problem, it's separate from me, it's impersonal for me, when in fact, the only thing that you can control genuinely is yourself. So if you don't master your own ideology, your own belief systems, your own practices, you can't be a transformational leader, and ultimately you can't change the things you want to change. So it has to start from the individual. And I do think, organizations in terms of power and policies definitely have a role to play, especially our political system, the practices we have when it comes to the justice system, and just genuine inequities we still have embedded in practice, even if it's not explicit law. But outside of that, even as for an association, because they play such a critical role in creating community and setting the standards and the baselines for an entire industry, examining your leadership beliefs and practices is critical, or else inequities are going to be perpetuated, even if it's not intentional. And sometimes it is intentional, but it's seen as not a big deal. So being able to really create an innovative, groundbreaking association requires that self-examination, that self-mastery.
I'm thinking about this, and, thinking about, as, say, an executive director of an association who is trying to represent their members, represent an industry or a science or a mission, and whom is also, they're responsible for speaking internally and externally and trying to make change happen. There's a lot going on during this particular time where, not only are we seeing this uprising where people are saying now is the time the buck stops here. Like, we need to make, as a society, we need to make some serious change now. And we have, a virus that's running rampant in our country right now.
Mm-hmm.
And it's causing a lot of people to not be sure of whether they're going to have a job or not. They're worried about their health. They're worried about their loved ones. They're worried about, what education looks like for their children. So there's a whole lot going on at a time like this that, I imagine that it's very stressful for someone to try to figure out, how do I make, real change happen and make strides in the right direction when I'm being overwhelmed by so much coming at me from every direction right now.
Yeah.
And to that, do you have advice? What do you say to someone like that right now?
Well, the interesting thing, especially from, my point of view as a Black woman, is that is my experience. Like, I think people
Yeah.
don't understand and realize that so many minorities deal with the stuff that we're seeing right now. They've been dealing with that before this. And we
Yeah.
were still required to show up to work fully. We're still required to turn things in on time and a deadline and operate at a high level. So I think there is space and room for empathy around how stressful this is. And also, if there are certain aspects of privilege, understanding that you have to improve your endurance. You
Yeah.
have to improve your endurance, because the issue is, a lot of people this is the first time. I actually heard a really good analogy. It was like, when it comes to social issues we're talking about, for most marginalized individuals, they're on chapter 400, and most people are starting at chapter 1. So there's this huge gap between the marathon and someone just starting their first. This is the first time I've ever run a mile and I'm exhausted. So being able to improve the endurance and not thinking I'm going to solve all of this and swoop in and save the world in one training and one book that I read and one, thing I attended. It's really, how does this become integrated into my identity?
Yeah.
Because until that happens, then it's a nice to have. It's a separate thing. It's seen as something that's not impacting you. And I think people are now realizing that this attitude of, these issues don't affect me, I'm not part of that community, so I can do what I can, but it's not really my thing. It's just not true, because human beings are so interconnected and so reliant on each other that it's a ripple effect. Whatever happens in one community will eventually tumble another. And that's what this virus represents really well. The idea of, we thought at the beginning of this in the United States that this would be an abroad issue. People were like, oh, that's really bad that that's happening in China and in Italy and these other places, but it probably won't be here. And we learned very quickly, whatever happened in these areas, it was going to come and impact us in various ways that we couldn't even understand at a rapid, breakneck pace. So I think this idea of, oh, I have so much going, I have so much stress, we have to kind of change that narrative, because we won't be able to get out of this problem without people understanding and realizing this is not a nice to have. It's not an addition. It's a requirement. It's a priority, or these issues will get worse.
Yeah.
And any kind of luxuries or any kind of conveniences or privileges you have are going to disappear. So I think it's important for people to see this as not a zero-sum game or something that's just another to-do on their list, but a priority in terms of personal development and genuine growth. People cannot reach their fullest potential. We cannot reach our highest levels of output or productivity or innovation without this. So I would change the lens and reframe it. Like, I am exhausted. I am tired. I mean, imagine doing all of this, and then you see people, like, I literally was thinking the other day that I have cousins who live in Utah, and I've been pulled over by the police a number of times in Utah while I was visiting home. And I'm like, if this happened to them and they're on the national news and having to debate people about their livelihoods and if they should be just considered basic humans, would be soul crushing.
Yeah.
I can't even imagine, just going through, and it's a possibility. It's not like something that may not happen. It could potentially happen. So I have to grapple with that reality on top of still having to show up, to do my job, to manage my life. There is no wiggle room for me to be able to say, I'm opting out of this. I don't want to be bothered. I don't get that opportunity. I don't get that luxury. So I think this idea of, well, we got so much going on, I just can't deal with this, it's bullshit, honestly.
Yeah,
and it's really
it
an
is.
aspect of privilege. So it's like, how can we change that narrative so we can be more productive as a society?
I completely agree. And I think that, it's been a long time that there have been these issues that have been more than troubling. It's not been okay. And, I think about the fact that we have the I can't breathe thing that is like, this man is dying and he's saying he can't breathe. And this has become this rallying cry. And the irony on me, it's not lost on me that we also have a virus that's causing people to not be able to breathe too. And it's as if right now at this moment in time, whether it's I'm getting very woo here, and I'm sorry for everyone that's watching, but whatever, I don't care, like, but here's the deal, it's like, what more do you need to hear? The man can't breathe. His rights are being crushed as an individual. The virus creates this ability where we can't breathe as people. We literally can't breathe, right? And it's coming through, and I feel like everything in the world, is saying it can't continue like this. We can't survive if we continue on this path. And there are so many different ways that we're being told this message, and in so many different communications, whether it's through a virus, whether it's through a socially significant moment in our country, whether it's through the environment that's saying, it's choking to death. We're literally killing ourselves in so many ways. And
you bring up a really good point about that. Makes me think more about narrative intelligence, which I find so fascinating. And it's whatever narratives are used to frame the issues become truth. So some of the narratives around the virus and what's happening or not happening, we have such a polarized experience of this virus right now solely because of stories that were shared.
Yeah.
Some of those stories were completely false narratives, but because they appealed to the baseline fear-based centers or self-preservation centers or people's ideas about, like, some people just, they should die. Like, it doesn't matter. People die every day. Why should I care about other individuals?
Right.
Those false narratives applied to those fears and those anxieties and made people feel comforted. It was like, I literally look at it like a country Southern biscuit, which is so tasty, right? Like if you put butter on it and it's so comforting, but if you eat that thing at every meal, you are going to be sick, right? So I'm like, you can't literally live your life seeking comfort at every moment and not deal with the realities of what is going on. So a lot of that does boil down to, what are our dominant narratives about community? A lot of people have an idea that there's some people that are inherently better than others. And if those people who are inherently worse die, who cares? And I've seen those arguments. They're individuals,
regardless of political, by the way, I see those arguments on both sides too.
Yeah, and it's like
really troublesome to me because, like, we shouldn't be okay with anyone dying. Like, this isn't good.
We have to redefine our narratives about community and about empathy and ultimately what it means as a society to take care of one another, because until we grapple with that, we're going to have this problem again. I think there's some people who have this idea that, well, I am this sort of solely independent, completely in control of my own destiny individual that doesn't need others. And that's nice in theory, but where was your phone made? Where was your computer made? Did you sew your own clothes? Did you make your own butter? Did you make your own food? If you did none of that, you are dependent on hundreds of people for your livelihood, for your consumption, for your life. And I think until people realize that we are deeply interwoven and connected to people all over the world at this stage, we're going to continue to have these issues. We are not these lonely islands. So how do we learn how to genuinely work together, take care of one another, understand how these short-term inconveniences of adapting our behaviors will lead to a longer-term thriving society? We are not thriving right now. We are surviving. And that is a result of short-sightedness and certain primal beliefs about how the world works that are really limiting. There's actually a really interesting study done called the Primal Belief Study, which relates to narrative intelligence, and I encourage everybody to look it up. I think it was originally supported by Yale, and there were two researchers who created it, but they wanted to understand, are there like core universal beliefs around the world or in different cultures that sort of are at the core of how people operate, because our beliefs and values are a huge aspect of our behaviors, whether we're conscious of them or not, which is why I talk about narrative intelligence so much. It makes you conscious of your beliefs. And so they found that there were these 26 primal beliefs about how people see the world, and they discovered them through, self-surveys, through analyzing cultural and social and religious texts, all this different information. And what I found fascinating is they could predict, based on what core beliefs that you most cherished and most valued, how much you would be on board or against inequity, how much empathy you might have, how you might see certain social issues, because it boils down to the fact that if you believe the world is inherently bad, if you believe hierarchy is inherently factual and just the way that the world has to work, there always has to be somebody on top and there always has to be someone oppressed. You have a completely different worldview, and the conversation is totally different than other primal beliefs. So that's what I find really interesting. It's like, how can us as a society redefine our core values and our core beliefs? Because some of them are not working and some of them are not living. We have core beliefs we talk about, but in terms of policy and how they're expressed in our companies and our organizations and our communities, is just non-existent. And I think we're at a time now where we can have that conversation. Maybe we make a new constitution. Maybe it's a new recommitment. Maybe it's a new structure or system, whatever that might be. We have that opportunity. And I think we do need to do those things to be able to excite people again about what is a social contract that we're holding with each other.
Right.
Because if we don't define that, it's just, again, automatic autopilot behaviors. And a lot of those habits are bad. Just like I said, if you're eating a country biscuit at every meal, it feels good now, but you're not going to feel good probably in even a month doing that every day. So we need to reconcile that.
So several times while we've been talking, you've brought up moments when you've caught my own, like the stories and the framing of an idea just as we've been going along. How often does that come up for you? Because I imagine when so much of your career is focused on working with people and identifying their stories, and also helping them to create a purposeful story, like what kind of story do you want to create, right? And to create the future and the brand that you're envisioning, your best you. How often does that happen for you on a regular basis, like all the time? Are you just naturally tuned into picking up the stories and identifying, these different narratives that we operate by? It'd be a really handy thing to do, I think.
That's a great question. I do think I think it comes from my childhood. I spent a lot of time reading. I read 3 or 4 books a week, at least, like as a kid. I was just reading a lot. I was writing at a very early age, and I was constructing stories at a very early age. I remember I had a radio show with my sister. I don't know if you remember the little toy called Girl Talk, which ages me a bit.
Yes.
Yeah, the Girl Talk, where you could record yourself on a little cassette tape.
Gosh.
And I would make these like elaborate, funny, like radio talk show things. And that kind of practicing of narrative, I don't know if it was because my family are all readers and we used to play like board games together and they sing. And so we had a lot of storytelling happening in the home. And then I had to learn very early on navigating the community and the cultures I was in Utah, because I was born and raised in Utah, to understand what narratives were motivating people's behaviors towards me. Mm-hmm. And I learned that at a very early age from my parents, from my cousins, just sort of like, here's probably what you're going to confront. Here's probably some of the biases or behaviors that are going to happen. And here's how you could potentially navigate that. So I had to be very perceptive. I think because I was an only to the extreme, I was pretty much usually like the only Black kid in my classes. I was not Mormon. Most people around me were Mormon, and a lot of people were Republican, and I was not. And so I had to learn to pick up different narratives and stories to understand where people were coming from and to be able to navigate different circles and different cultures. And so it was just from practice. Some of it was survival. Some of it was practice. So I had a lifetime of that. I mean, years and years and years of that. And then in my career in the last 10 years, I started out in the law world, but then I went to the nonprofit space, the media and marketing and sales. And in all those roles, I was learning how to use story, but to sell products. Like we use story mostly in marketing. People understand it for that. It's like, if you construct narratives a certain way, if you tell a certain visual story, if you evoke a certain emotion, you're going to get a specific engagement, action, or result. And so I learned that prescriptively to close $6.5 million in sales in my career, to motivate 300,000 young people to get involved in social causes. And I was like, wait a minute, we know how to use this in these ways. Why don't we use story to be able to change certain social issues? Why aren't we using it in this way? And so it came out of that practice in my career, and then also just reading and studying and learning more about it as I was curious. And I think anybody through practice, reading, and education can improve their ability to pick up narratives, to understand the stories that are shaping individuals and cultures and other classes. I mean, even in college, I had to learn that. My major was policy analysis and management. I went to Cornell University, and that's how I ended up in New York, actually. And it was interesting because a lot of my classes were about unpacking ideologies at different points in the country and how it shaped policy. So it was sort of like, here's what people believed about women. And so this is why they had all these rules about they can't own property, you can't vote, you can't X, Y, and Z. Here's what the welfare queen, where that narrative and that myth came from and how that operated. So I had to learn that in my classes and to unpack policy and history around the flavor of the values of that time. And every culture within every few decades shifts a bit. So it was interesting to see that history play out, and it was part of my education. But I think I just opted into it because I was curious. And the curiosity came from living in a place where I could see people were so deeply shaped by narrative, even religion. You know, a lot of people I was around were highly religious, and everything they were learning was narrative. It was a narrative of the past, narratives of their, prophecies and the people who they follow, the prophets they follow. And so that was interesting to me. I'm like, like these narratives really shape them. They shape the practices, the things that they do. How can I learn how to unpack that? And so, yeah, it just came from this curiosity, this practice, and also education.
Yeah, I love the fact that it's all stemming from curiosity. And, within a lot of these things we're talking about, there's I think a lot of people feel and I do too, the negativity that we see that is on social media. And, they'll talk about the media, and it seems like there's a lot of negative news and, a lot of vitriol that it's being expressed. But at the same time, in such a relatively short amount of time, there has already been a lot of change, not just with technology, but if you think about the fact that like women owning land, and the fact that it wasn't that long ago when we had segregation. I mean, it has been, of course, not fast enough, but it has been relatively fast in a short amount of time if we look through history. And so what it does is it gives me hope, because it gives me hope for what's possible now and in the future. If we take yours, like what you're talking about with, crafting a narrative on purpose and deciding and saying, okay, so where are our stories now? And how do we want those stories to change? We totally have the ability to make this so much better really quickly.
I love that idea. I think you're right on point with that, where this is why narrative intelligence is so empowering, because it allows you to have the full picture. And when you see the full picture of human history and cultural development, you realize that you're right. Oh, we have made some significant strides. I mean, my grandmother was born into segregation. She's alive still. It's not like this was hundreds of years ago and it was just this antiquated in a history book sort of thing. She would talk very openly about living in Memphis, Tennessee, and there are parts of the city she could not go to because she could be killed and it would be legal. And she'd be like, we couldn't go there. We couldn't go in certain stores. You couldn't go in certain movie theaters. You had to sit in the back, all these rules. And it was just factual, and it was explicit law. It wasn't just this, imperceptive, we don't know what it is. And so I think people understanding that with social progress, I kind of see it like a jagged stepladder, where it's 2 steps forward, 1 step back, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. And every time we've had any sort of progress, there's always been a backlash. After the civil rights movement, all the, Reaganomics and everything else that came from that, and the policing of Black communities overly in certain ways, all of that was a response to the civil rights movement, we're having that same thing now. A lot of the backlash we're seeing is a response to the first Black man ever being in the presidency and people's feelings about that. And that unearthed a lot of feelings. It made people afraid. It made them uncomfortable. It made them scared about the future and how it's changing and who has power and who doesn't. And this is a direct result of that. There's always been a backlash. And you can study that in history and see anytime there's been any sort of cultural or social progress, there's a backlash. And so that's why I'm like, even when it was happening, I'm like, you know what? After this, in like 3 or 4 years, we're going to have a back. And I remember talking to my friends about this probably like 5 years ago.
Are you like right now calling them up and be like, I told you?
Yeah, I was like, I knew this was going to happen. And I told you guys, people were not going to be happy about this. And I think it comes down to, and this is what I think about a lot, which is if we can get people to understand their deeper purpose in like just a very clear way, if we can have people operate from empowering values, how does that change this conversation? Because most people are operating from fear, just straight up. Their value system is, I must survive, I have to pay this bill or else, I must go to school or else, I have to get married or else, I have to do this job. It's always an or else conversation where they must and they should. And that all boils down to deep anxieties. Now, not to say that fear isn't valid. There are very many reasons why fear can be useful. But if it's the only value that you revere, the way that you operate and what you build is limited. And so I think about this a lot, which is what would happen if every person uncovered their unique strengths, they lived within those strengths every single day, their creativity every single day, they brought it to problems that they're insatiably curious about solving. What would our society look like then? If it wasn't a society where we're all playing these sort of rote, routine consumption roles, and instead we're living in creativity, ingenuity, kind of like Captain Planet, if you're familiar with that cartoon. Yeah. Their powers combined. And I did a podcast episode recently. I have this podcast called Sway Them in Color, and I interviewed a woman who has a company called Love and Magic, and she did a TED Talk recently about diversity that she essentially said, I think we need to reframe diversity as symphony. Mm-hmm. What if we're being able to bring all these different sounds and instruments into the chorus, and symphony is really just a blending of everybody's unique strengths and talents? What would the world look like then if we actually lived in symphony? And I think that's an amazing metaphor, because that's where I want us to strive towards, living in symphony, seeing difference as exciting and as possibility, and as, you know, the wonderful aspect of humanity and our planet is the unique ways that things grow and evolve and thrive. And so I hope that we get to a place where people aren't living in the lowest form of function, which is survival and fear. Yeah. And we move people away from that. And it doesn't mean being opulently wealthy or even that. Like, redefining what success actually means is not a constant striving and a constant consumption. It's creation, it's creativity, and it's talent seeking and talent expression. And so I would hope that we get to that place so that people can really thrive and live in ways that we haven't really seen before. I think we're getting closer to it because we have all these tools at our disposal. Like, if you look at Gen Z, which is called Zoomers now, I'm blown away by the fact that so many of them are so freaking creative. Like, the of videos and interesting ways that they're expressing themselves is unprecedented. We've never had this much self-expression on a global scale ever in human history.
It's amazing. And I think we I say we as a whole, I think in general, I think we underappreciate that creativity that's coming out of there, because it does seem to be ubiquitous, because it does seem to be everywhere. And we imagine that that because of that, there's not as much value in it. But my God, I mean, so much creativity from so many different people. What does that mean when you have an entire generation that they have these new creative ways to express themselves? And so many of them are. And I mean, yes, we see, you know, superficial things like on TikTok, like dance or whatever, but they're not only are they a sign of immense creativity, but some are doing really meaningful, transformative work on there at a young age. And
like what I was doing when I was 12 was like eating hot Cheetos and like climbing trees. I wasn't doing anything about like trying to usurp Trump's, campaign
Right.
or whatever by
I
getting
was a
tickets
latchkey kid.
online or
I was eating bowls of chips and watching like old reruns of Scooby-Doo or something.
right. I wasn't doing any of that. And I think, people, there is always a dark side to anything. And even there's a dark side to storytelling, which I kind of highlighted with how narrative is being used to create the systems we see right now with COVID
Yeah.
and everything. But I
Yeah.
think we started to implement within our education system that self-mastery and self-awareness I told you about,
Mhm.
and helping people to channel their strengths and their talents and their interests into these tools at an early age. You can have
Mhm.
people be much more productive and creative from the get-go. Instead of complaining about people putting up stupid videos, maybe we teach kids how to have purposeful, interesting expression from a very young age so they can use these things as tools and not just as consumption or something else. And I think it's possible to do that if we start teaching it early and getting people to understand themselves. The only time in my entire education that I remember having some really deep self-examination and practicing was in college. I took this career development class,
Mhm.
and the whole class was actually a huge amount of self-reflection. We had to read all these resources and these career books and really examine ourselves and our values and our beliefs and what we wanted and what our goals
It
were.
sounds like an amazing class.
It
I
was amazing, and I
like
created this portfolio that I still refer to this portfolio is 10 years old, and I
wow.
still look back at it and be like, "This is so good." Like, I think having those places and spaces, whether it's within our companies or organizations or even our schools, to self-reflect, to uncover our deeper values and our goals is so critical to being able to create thriving communities and thriving societies.
Hmm. Oh my God. Those are words to really think on. And I'm so thankful that you came to talk with us today, because I think that, you know, from the sounds of, when we've talked before this, but it sounds like that's kind of what you're bringing to people when you work with them and when you go and work with groups is, really helping them to understand themselves better, understand where their values are, and identifying those stories. And so if people want to reach out to you, what's the best way for them to connect with you?
Absolutely, and thank you for summarizing. It's the perfect way of summarizing the work that I do, which is that self-examination, self-reflection. But they can find me at thenewquo.com. I have tons of information about the trainings I do and the consulting I do, or you can email me at Christina@thenewquo.com.
And what's the name of your podcast again?
Sway Them in Color. It is on
Yeah.
Spotify. It is in Apple iTunes. I think there's an Android platform that it's shared on. But yeah, I have like about 20 episodes. It's all about leadership, like unconventional leadership. I've interviewed shaman and sex educators and performers and all types of individuals and got in their leadership perspectives and their stories. So it's definitely a really interesting listen. At least I'm obviously biased because I created it, but I think it's a good listen.
Well, I'll have to go and check it out. Thank you again for coming on. And I really can't wait until we have a chance to talk with you again.
Thank you for having me.
All right. So thank you. I am so glad that everyone had a chance to get to meet Christina and find out a little bit more about her. If you look in the show notes after this, I'm going to make sure that we have links to all of her, to her podcast, to her website. That's thenewquo.com that you've got to check out. And I would encourage all of us to be exploring a little bit about our own narratives, our own stories that we're telling ourselves. How are we framing our own work and figuring out how to make things better for the people around us? How are we framing our own stories? This is something that requires a little self-reflection and probably something that will benefit all of us. So until next time, everyone, keep asking questions to learn every day. As Joseph Campbell once said, the cave you fear to enter holds the treasure you seek. Have a great week, everyone.